Can you all hear me on this microphone? Am I good right at the back? Okay, I just realized I didn't have my notes, so for a moment I thought I would speak without notes, which is an interesting feeling to have at the start of a conversation like this, so thank you so much for turning up. Thank you very much for being here. I think some of you know that I struggle to start. I think you'll remember from my previous series that I always harped on about the fact that I don't know where to start. And I bumped into a student out there, and she said, "What are you doing, Professor Mentzel?" And I said, "Well, I'm going for a walk." She said, "Why are you going for a walk?" And I said, "Well, I don't know where to start when I speak, and I need to figure something out." And I said, "But I'm thinking of starting at the beginning of time." And she said, "Well, you know, that's a good spot to start." Accepting that I'm not going to do that, and instead want to start on an altogether more somber note, which is this note that relates to the nature of philosophy, which is, of course, the essential nature of philosophy is, of course, a love of wonder. So if you think about the philosophical endeavor, at its heart lies a very deep love and adoration of the attitude, if you like, the contemplative attitude of wonder. And I had all the wonder beaten out of me as a child under apartheid, physically and psychologically beaten out of me. I had no wonder left. I was told what to believe. I was forced into a dogmatic way of thinking about the world. And if that's the case for a privileged white boy like me, and I never purport to know what it was like to be black under apartheid, it was, of course, an abject horror of the worst kind. And so as I walked around there thinking about joining with you today, and in the context of the warm and genuinely warm welcome you've given me, and the way I feel about sharing with you, and the extent to which you enthuse me also to prepare mindfully even more because of your kindness, I also thought I felt comfortable enough sharing perhaps a little more personally with you, just a small bit of what it was like also for me to have grown up under these awful circumstances, which of course is not entirely fair in the context of other folk, my brothers and sisters who were, because they were black, having much more than the wonder beaten out of them, the entire life beaten out of them. And then I did, I think, promise you at some point when I described the processes, and I thank you kindly for the analogy, that were the midwives to the TRC that enabled the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to be born in South Africa. I did say that there was a particular time when a bunch of fascist thugs on the right wing chased us around with guns. And I think I might have said I would show you some footage of that. So if it's okay, I'd start perhaps with that footage, which relates to a previous lecture, but I hope you'll indulge me, and I'll show that. And then we'll press on with the structure and functioning of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission itself. We'll look a little bit at what it itself thought its role was, before we move on to other far more philosophical and moral and ethical issues in the next 2 or 3 weeks. Does that sound like a reasonable agenda? So I'm going to try the technology. It worked at 8 o'clock this morning, but that means nothing. And just by way of introduction, this was literally when the World Trade Center, which is the place where we were negotiating peace in the early 90s, when this was stormed by the right wing, a political party or a movement, if you like, called the Afrikaner Weerstandsbeweging, the Afrikaner Resistance Movement, who stormed this building. And this gives you a sense also of what it was like in real life to experience this hybridity that I spoke about in the theoretical introduction. This will give you a sense of just how messy a transition really is. So let's see if I can get this up.
Een ding moet die wêreld daar buitekant weet. Ons kan nie sonder vryheid lewe en as dit dan moet, dan sal ons hom pas met die geweldbare krag.
Eugene TERRE.
That one or another time the government will capitulate and hand over the country to the communist forces.
Fearing they would be swamped by the ANC's advance, they wanted out.
My people, the Afrikaner folk, really has a right, according to international law, to demand some part of this land as their own. You have a place where a Brit can be British. I must have land where the Afrikaner, the Boer, can be a Boer.
A more moderate advocate of Afrikaner separatism was Constant Viljoen. He and TERRE BLANCHE both belonged to an alliance of more than 20 right-wing movements, the Afrikaner Volksfront. Viljoen was a former chief of the South African Defence Force and a war hero. In June 1993, after giving notice to the authorities, Viljoen took a petition to the multi-party conference.
We were going to hand over at the World Trade Center some demands by the Volksfront. In other words, to have self-determination for the Afrikaner people. That was the intention.
The AWB, Avia Beer in Afrikaans, were among the petitioners.
Eventually we got news that some of the people entering rather late were harassed at the gate. Some people were pulled out of their cars. It was getting a bit more ugly.
Then when the gates went open, the people started moving in, and then people started running.
TERRE BLANCHE was leading the AWB contingent.
And we tried to stop the crowd in front of the building. I actually ran ahead myself because I realized what was taking place and I was going to stop them, and I did so. I got on top of a pole and I sort of signaled to all the people and they did stop. And the whole crowd would have stopped in a very orderly manner. And then some AWB members on a vehicle came through. They ignored the warnings to stop.
They look like they're invading the place. Oh, look at it!
All of a sudden I saw the security people running out, and I said, "What's up?" And they said, they've broken through and they're coming. And then my own security man simply grabbed hold of me and ran.
Pandemonium just broke out in the entire building. Many people on the ANC side, from the government side, all huddled into the government offices. We thought the right-wingers would never dare just march into government offices and start accosting people or assaulting them. And in fact, we even feared that we would be shot at.
The AWB overwhelmed the police, who retreated before them.
Signs of glass and everything shattering and everything, and reports coming through that they are looking for us, particularly Rolf and Cyril.
Terrified delegates barricaded themselves in their offices. In the conference chamber, the AWB chanted and daubed slogans demanding a separate white state.
An important turning point in this process was when
it's hard to follow that. That's where that ends. It's hard to follow that for with any sort of fluid immediacy. When one relives some of that, it isn't a it isn't an easy thing to think about some of the things that have occurred, in our past, and that one in particular during a time of peace, as you can just imagine, us hiding away from, but I said I would show you that. I think that might give you some context in relation to what it really means to broker and negotiate a peace settlement, and the reality of it as juxtaposed against even the theory and some of the presentation and the content that we then engage with, sometimes rather more sterilely than some of that kind of footage then gives us a sense of the reality which is depicted through the theory and through the papers. And yes, sir, I know you have a burning question, but we'll take those right at the end. So if you can just keep that question, then if that's okay, then we'll take that question at the end. Right, so I want to talk today, and having caught my breath, about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's structure and terms of reference and what it thought it might try and achieve in South Africa, with a view to heading towards the bigger dilemmas around truth and justice and reparation and so forth in the next few lectures. So of course, in the first instance, you can think of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission as having a focus on the most egregious of the human rights abuses that occurred in South Africa. So you need to think about the emphasis there on the worst of the human rights abuses. And in terms of its functioning and in considering those egregious human rights abuses, it was limited in time from the period March 1960 through April 1994. That was the time period which would come under its microscope, if you like to think of it that way. Now, the other thing, and I want to meander just briefly back to the Constitutional Court here before I continue, besides the TRC having the baggage of the amnesties that I described, and remember we spoke about the problematic nature of some of that amnesty that it inherited. Of course, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission also functioned within the context of a then newly agreed constitution, and that you can see in the context of that question I had about multitasking. We had a constitutional process going on at the same time as the Act, and then the TRC was put into place. So we were doing a few things in a transition at the same time. And indeed, even the Constitution itself was based on an interim constitution which had been negotiated in the negotiation process and was, in fact, the bedrock on which the new Constitution was established. Now, why did we need a constitutional court? Why did we need a constitutional court? Well, of course, in 1994, when you look back at the judiciary looked just like me, perhaps a little older, but certainly white, male-dominated judiciary. And in that respect, it was very limited in terms of legitimacy and capacity to support a transition to a new democracy, and indeed was very limited in relation to the extent to which justice could be administered in a credible way in South Africa. And so there was an agreement that we have this court, this constitutional court, which would would exercise oversight also over our newly established Bill of Human Rights. So the question in the constitutional negotiation process was really what sort of institution was needed to act as an ombudsman across the transition, and the answer was, in order to protect the Constitution, in order to protect human rights, we needed a specialized constitutional court. Some countries have opted for hybrids. Some countries have been able to revert to the previous judicial system that existed. In our case, it was, in many respects, a constitutional court that was the only thing that could take us through this transition. And of course, that was the product of compromise. It was inaugurated on Valentine's Day. We South Africans like Valentine's Day. And to lighten things up, I'll show you footage of Desmond Tutu, Archbishop Emeritus Desmond Tutu, getting a lovely bouquet of flowers on Valentine's Day. His staff loved him. And on the 15th of February 1995, our 11 Constitutional Court judges took their seats to hear their first case. Now, what was their first case? Their first case is known as S versus Makwanyane, and this case was a question of considering the constitutionality or otherwise of the death penalty. That was its first case. Now, I ask the question, why is that fitting? Why is it unsurprising? Well, for 3 days, our justices sat to listen to the arguments, and in fact, the actual facts of the case, the Constitutional Court felt, were less important than the question relating to the constitutionality or otherwise of the death penalty itself. So that's what this trial became. Did the death penalty violate sections 9, 10, and 11 of our new Constitution, which, in order, guaranteed the right to life, the right to dignity, and the right to be free from torture and cruel punishment? And you can see why the Constitution, in the context of our past, made these provisions, amongst other things, because how many people had the right to life? Who had the right to life in the former apartheid-run South Africa? Who had the right to dignity in the past? And who had the right to be free from cruel and inhumane torture? So, of course, our Constitution, quite rightly so, despite our past, made these provisions. And the judgment of the court on the 6th of June 1995 was a unanimous one, that the death penalty violated the right to life, it wasn't dignified, and it was a cruel and inhumane form of punishment. And so the death penalty was ruled unconstitutional in South Africa. But the other thing that the Constitutional Court did was it ratified the final constitution. So it played, remember when I spoke about that messiness between ideal justice and politics? It played a role there in legitimizing and giving credibility to new legal instruments, including our new constitution. And of course, these documents were important in relation to the establishment then of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission itself, which you can see then as being a product of the law, as much as it is a product of also the wish of people in South Africa and civil society. So again, in the context of that theoretical hybrid model that I was suggesting, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission had a legal mandate. It was mandated legally to do certain things. And so there was an act that was established which I want to read to you, because this act describes the mandate of the Commission. This is what the Commission legally was mandated and required to do. And I've got it here in nice big text so I can read it. So its mandate as set out in the Act was to provide for the investigation and establishment of as complete a picture as possible of the nature and extent of all gross violations of human rights committed within or outside the Republic of South Africa during the period 1 March 1960 to 5 December 1993. I'm going to talk about how that date changed. And emanating from the conflicts of the past and of the fate or whereabouts of the victims of such violations. It was required to do that. It was required to focus on the granting of amnesty to certain persons in respect of acts associated with political objectives committed during the said period. It was required to take measures aimed at the restoration of human and civil dignity and the rehabilitation of victims of gross human rights violations. It was required to report to the nation about these violations and victims, and it was required to make recommendations aimed at the prevention of the commission of gross violations of human rights. So that is the National Unity and Reconciliation Act, the specific section in that act which gave birth to the TRC and tasked it with those specific things. So in order to do that, of course, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission needed a structure. And the structure that it decided on was to have 3 committees. The first of those committees is known as a Human Rights Violations Committee. So there was this thing known as the Human Rights Violations Committee. What did that committee do? It did 2 things. It conducted public hearings across the entire breadth of the country. Hearings at which survivors would be able to testify and tell their stories, their stories of violation, their stories of suffering. And the other thing which this Human Rights Violations Commission did, or committee, sorry, did, was to conduct research itself and investigations itself into gross violations to address, in fact, particular individual cases. The second structure was an amnesty committee. So you had a Human Rights Violations Committee, and then you had an amnesty committee. And what was the purpose of the amnesty committee? Well, of course, it was to grant amnesty. And how did it do that? There were 4 requirements which people who testified before it seeking amnesty, there were 4 requirements that they needed to meet. Do you know those 4 requirements? You might guess some of them. One of them was to tell the truth. So the committee and the commission needed to be satisfied that a perpetrator was telling the truth. Another was that they had to satisfy the committee and the commission that they had a political objective. It wasn't good enough to say you'd murdered someone. That's a criminal act. You had to have had a political motive. The third one was the time period. Obviously, you could only apply for amnesty within a certain time period, and that time period was spelt out in the act. And fourthly, and importantly, and there were people who applied for amnesty and satisfied all 3 of these criteria, but fell on this 4th one, is that the proportionality of the acts which were committed, there needed to be a proportionality in relation to political objectives. And so if your human rights abuses were out of all proportion with your political objectives, and if the things you had committed were so horrendous that they simply were of such a nature that they were, as we called Eugene de Kock, pure evil, then you would fall on that point. And so you could fall on these 4 points: proportionality in relation to the nature of the offence and its related objective. If there was a disproportionality between the offence and the objective you sought to achieve. So you might want to, and I should show you this actually, because there were so many words for taking someone out, removing someone from. Actually, I really want to show you that. Next week I will show you National Party politicians confronted with their own documents, having to read them out to the Commission, trying to describe to the Commission what these words meant, which in effect were, you know, murder. So your act had to be in proportion to your objective. There was a third committee, the so-called Reparation and Rehabilitation Committee. And that Reparation and Rehabilitation Committee was meant to develop comprehensive recommendations for government on reparation policy and its implementation. So maybe I'll briefly just reflect on those, because it's less about the technicalities of those than about the impact and implications of some of those committees. Can you see one big disjuncture there between the Human Rights Violations Committee and the Amnesty Committee and the Reparation and Rehabilitation Committee. This disconnect relates to this thing that I'm told doesn't exist, which is time. Thank you. There you are. Yeah, which I agree with, by the way. The Amnesty Committee was the one that had the most immediacy in time. It could immediately implement, and it could immediately, after some hearings, grant amnesty. The Human Rights Violations Committee took much longer time to dig at the truth and get the truth out and understand the truth. And the Rehabilitation and Reparation Committee could only, over a long period of time, make recommendations to the government. So it was constrained in terms of acting. It couldn't act. And what that brings about, and we'll talk about this, is a sense in now of people getting off scot-free when I've got nothing in return. I haven't been given any reparations, but that person immediately, got amnesty. And that's a problem in a truth and reconciliation process. That's a significant problem which creates problematic dynamics at all levels of, if you like, society. So I wanted briefly to reflect there, not so much on the fact that we had these things because they're right to have, but the ways in which they were constrained in terms of delivering that which they might have been tasked to do. And so when we get critical of the TRC and especially reparation, it's also important to bear in mind what some of its constraints were, because some of its legal constraints were actually problems. You can imagine that the question of who sat on this commission was a big deal. Who were the commissioners? Who would be the commissioners that would be the arbiters across the range of human rights violations, reparations, and amnesties? And during the passing of the legislation that put this commission into place, human rights and civil society groups were vocal, in fact, in their contributions to lobbying, especially for a open, transparent nomination process to put commissioners into place, in contradistinction, of course, to the past, where we never had any transparency and openness. Now, the Act allowed the President, who at the time was, of course, President Mandela, the Act allowed him to appoint, allowed the President to appoint the commissioners. But, of course, Mandela didn't do that. He introduced a public participatory process. He preferred rather than by presidential decree, he preferred to open it up to public participation. And in fact, 229 names were put forward to this committee that he had put in place. And the committee then narrowed these down from 46 to 25. And ultimately, the 25 names were put forward to President Mandela, and he chose 17 of those and added one or two, in fact, that weren't on the list, but didn't exercise his option to include international commissioners on the commission. So we didn't have any sitting international commissioners on that commission. And let me tell you, that's true of the entire process. We didn't want international meddling. I think I might have told you that in a previous discussion. And that's because we felt it was very important for us to resolve our issues for ourselves and to sort things out amongst ourselves. It's not that we didn't learn from we did, but we just didn't want direct international participation in some of these, especially much more close, much more intimate processes, which really is what a TRC is all about. It's very close and very intimate and very revealing. Of course, the nature of the background. So the backgrounds. Who were these people? This needed to be a diverse commission. You can imagine that South Africans wouldn't have been happy if it didn't reflect the true diversity of our country, which now for the first time was being allowed to come out into the open and flourish. And so the background of these folk, so there was representation from all racial groups. That's a given. Whites were a little overrepresented with 6 positions. 7 women were appointed. Amazing, awesome. Women were beginning to be recognized in the new South Africa as needing to be part of all positions of government and indeed the economy as well. Not that we've made enough progress, by the way, but I'm talking about this particular. There were 3 Christian ministers who were appointed, including the chair. I mean, he's pretty high-profile Christian minister. None of them were active politicians. 2 were former parliamentarians. Many of them had been engaged in some form of activism, certainly in the sort of broader legal and medical fields in particular. But certainly controversially, most of these commissioners were drawn from the anti-apartheid, broadly speaking, the anti-apartheid world. And so that you can begin to see causes questions and politics around the complexion of the commission. Now I want to be clear about this point, that you might think it was euphoric, and you might think we all wanted an election, and you might think we all wanted a constitution, and you might think we all wanted a TRC, but it wasn't plain sailing. And so it was with this TRC as well. And I think as I begin to sketch out now the messiness associated with it, you will see indeed the extent to which something which we now think is an amazing thing was contested, even whilst we were putting it in place and even whilst it was happening in South Africa. Many South Africans, significant numbers of South Africans, were opposed to that detailed introspection process that we had of our past. True of both political elites across the spectrum as well as their constituencies. Not everyone was saying, wow, we want this thing. Yes, let's have it. You can imagine that the functionaries of the apartheid system, the beneficiaries of the apartheid system, that these people, the security forces, the fragmented right-wing political forces, those who had been given power and privilege in those ethnic Bantustans that the apartheid government had put in place, lots of people, self-governing regimes, lots of people wanted, were opposed to the TRC. Members of Umkhonto weSizwe, the spear of the nation, the armed wing of the African National Congress, did not want the TRC. There were many of us who felt, many of us, when I say us, South Africans, who felt that the TRC would be used as a political weapon, either way around, that it would be used as a political weapon to get at the other party. In fact, the Afrikaner often said that the TRC would be the weapon that the ANC uses to gain retribution and revenge. The Zulus, the Inkatha Freedom Party, wanted nothing to do with this thing. They rejected it. And remember, they were part and parcel of this thing at the time called the Government of National Unity. So when you think of our transition, we had a constitutional process going on. We had just had an election, had a constitutional process going on, had a truth and reconciliation process going on, and another thing we had was a Government of National Unity, which was meant to be representative of the IFP, the ANC, and the National Party. Any party that had gotten above 5% in the elections was represented in this Government of National Unity. So just to give you a sense also of transitional structures and what was happening at the time, we had this thing called a GNU, a GNU. Do you know what a GNU is? A wildebeest. Awesome. I have a picture of it. It's an ugly creature, I mean, beautiful in its ugliness, yeah, a GNU, which was, of course, so very apposite for the GNU, you know, the GNU, it looked just like it was. So the IFP denounced this position, did not want to participate in this process, and certainly the National Party and the IFP criticized many of the commissioners, including the chair, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and the National Party in particular didn't like Wynand Malan, who I understand has now passed. I didn't know he had passed on, because they had a history of altercation, not so much with Wynand Malan, but with Alex Bahrain, the deputy chair, whom they really didn't like. So there were also political, you know, problems with the chair, the vice chair, and some of the members of the group, of the commission. A lot of this opposition was sensationalized in our media at the time, and I want to talk a little bit about the double-edged nature of the media in relation to the openness and transparency of this process. Nothing is ever easy, is it? Nothing is ever straightforward. You might think transparency is a wonderful criterion, but of course, you know, you have challenges even with that. What all this debate about the nature of the commission did, though, for us, despite all the politicking and the messiness of it, was it brought to the fore a particularly important question. A question which would dog the process right through and beyond when it was happening in South Africa. And this is the question of neutrality. So this debate, this political and social debate, was a question for us around what does it mean? How do we achieve neutrality in this process? How do we achieve neutrality in a Truth and Reconciliation Commission? How do we manage? Is it possible? Is it ever possible? And of course, we never came up with a full and clear and satisfactory answer to that question, excepting to say that we put together the commission that we did. And that was our answer to that question then of neutrality, by putting Archbishop Desmond Tutu in and the other commissioners. And indeed then saying the way in which it functioned would be a test of its neutrality. So I'm going to jump ahead a little bit now, right all the way to perhaps after the commission had finished, but I'm not going to do it in any substantive way. I just want to describe to you a little bit of the turbulence that surrounded, in fact, South Africans accepting or rejecting the TRC. And what do you think was the issue, the first and primary issue that caused South Africans to have problems with the TRC? Reparations, retribution, and amnesty. Yeah? So amnesty, all linked. So yeah, to amnesty. And so this question of amnesty led to a legal challenge on the constitutionality of conditional amnesty provisions. The argument put forth was the conditional amnesty inherent in the Act and inherent in the functioning of the TRC was unconstitutional. This legal challenge was mounted by political activists, the families of political activists who had died under suspicious circumstances, including families of Stephen Bantu Biko, Steve Biko, Griffiths Mtenge. And these folk challenged the amnesty provisions, which of course was then so a challenge in the Constitutional Court. Yeah. And you can see where they're coming from, of course. That's why I asked the question, what do you think was one of the sticking points, was this question of amnesty? The Constitutional Court upheld the constitutionality of the conditional amnesty provisions under which the TRC operated. And it upheld, in fact, also the fact that survivors wouldn't have a right to legal redress in instances where a perpetrator had been granted amnesty. But it did emphasize and place a responsibility on the TRC to proactively secure all information possibly relevant to the circumstances around which amnesty was being considered and ultimately granted. So the TRC had to proactively go and seek and find out what the circumstances of these cases were, and also had to and the Constitutional Court also emphasized the importance of reparations and the provision of reparations for survivors in instances of amnesty. Yeah. So Chief Justice Ismail Mohammed at the time cited the provisions in particular of reparations and the requirement that the TRC be proactive as a satisfactory substitute for the right of individuals to seek redress in criminal and civil courts. It's known as the Azapo case, and if you're interested, you can look it up as the Azapo case, and you can find out much more about this. And indeed, I am not going to go into all the legal challenges. So there's an idea. I just said all the legal challenges, didn't I? Oh dear. Yeah. I'm not going to go into the entire, it's probably a series on its own again, and you can read about them in the TRC's final report. If anyone here is legally minded, there were a bunch of these things across a range of different angles from, let me not run ahead of myself. So the TRC, founded by the Constitution, was bound by largely untested new constitution on the one hand, and bound by amnesty and the Constitutional Court and other transitional new democratic institutions on the other. And in fact, if you think about the range of those legal challenges, then it's somewhat ironic, for me at least, to think that the perpetrators of human rights violations, those who were opposed, in fact, even to some of what we did in the peace process, then began to use the new constitution to hide behind to launch cases. Suffice it to say that considerable attention and resources were diverted from the Commission for purposes of navigating its way through a legal minefield, as it now all of a sudden began to navigate through all these legal challenges that began to crop up. Unexpected. No one thought that we would have that extent then also of legal objection to the TRC. The Commission was faced, in its own words, I take these words from its report, with an intimidating array of substantive and procedural challenge from its inception. I can show you Desmond Tutu, when he talks about the extent to which he and his commissioners had to focus on legal challenges rather than getting on with the work of the TRC. On top of this, the TRC itself was given very limited financial and human resources to do what it needed to do. And these plagued its existence all the way through. If you think that this might have been a one-sided challenge against the TRC, all political parties, all major political parties took umbrage at some respect of the TRC. So don't think of this as a one-sided attack by, say, the National Party or something like that. The state president prior to F.W. de Klerk, who was the last white state president, his name was P.W. Botha, and we knew him as die groot krokodil, the great crocodile, because he wagged his finger at us on TV and told us what to do, you know, in that traditional authoritarian Afrikaner dictatorial style. And of course we were terrified, you know, petrified, all of us, black and white alike. He defied a subpoena by the TRC and simply refused to cooperate with it. He simply said, no, I'm not turning up. The ANC, at the end of the process, the African National Congress, was surprised by some of the attributions made to it in the findings in relation to gross human rights violations, and filed a suit in the Constitutional Court in an attempt to block the release of the final report. The Inkatha Freedom Party, our Zulu brothers and sisters, by and large, filed suit over statements that were made in the final report, which blamed the Inkatha Freedom Party, amongst other things, for fomenting violence. Held up the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission all the way to 2003. And so you can see me also moving ahead into our next 3 lectures as I, on the one hand, say, you know, we had 2 years of TRC, but what did we really have, and what did that look like, and how did that work out? You know, some interesting times ahead. Opinion polls at the time were pretty split, though, around white-black lines in relation to support for and excitement around and attitudes towards the TRC. Archbishop Desmond Tutu often asserted that whereas the majority of black folk were embracing reconciliation by and large, white folk were generally far less accommodating and far more apparently indifferent to the entire process. How am I doing for time? 25 minutes. I'm going to look a little bit at what the TRC thought of itself, the TRC looking in the mirror, thinking about its own role. I think it's important. And then from the next discussion onwards, we can get more critical and look at it. But I think it's fair to begin to understand what the TRC thought of itself and thought its job was. So let's spend 10 minutes doing that, and then we're going to have some Q&A, yeah? Or 5, and we'll have some Q&A. It looks like there are questions. So, you know, I prefer Q&A. I prefer questions to talking. Yeah, I know, and I like the format, which means I can now talk and tell you my preference without any, you know, without any, and that's part of the problem why I don't like it, is because it's a little bit, you know, it isn't as participatory as I like. And the other thing about it is I don't always know your needs, and I prefer when you ask a question to go in on that. So it helps me tailor it a little bit. So what we will do is I'll stop in 5. I'll stop in 5. And by the way, next week I do want to go back to the beginning of time, because I'm not letting that go. I'm not letting that go. I got a letter today that was dated tomorrow, and the letter was written as if tomorrow was today, and it's about the TRC, and I want to read that letter next week. But the thing is, you know, so time is apparently, you know, going so fast that I get a letter dated tomorrow and I read it today. and when I tell folk that there's that technological change is so rapid that we can't cope with it, they don't believe me. When I tell them that cyber warfare is happening right now to the extent that there are 1 million attacks a day on government departments, and that when one of our admirals suggests to the Senate that we should put together a cyber academy, of course, in traditional warfare, you build an academy and you train your soldiers, and 5 years later you have officers who can lead and think strategically and all of that stuff, fire cannons and things. There's no more time now to build a cyber academy. And so the whole point is, no admiral, and in fact the admiral was also saying this, so in his defense, saying, well, we need to find this expertise elsewhere because it's happening yesterday. And so this sense of it's happening yesterday, I don't know if you feel it. Do you feel it? It's happening yesterday. Because I feel as if I'm being shoved into tomorrow when I'm not really wanting to be there yet, but I have no choice but to read a letter dated tomorrow. And of course, I get it in the internet. I get it in my inbox. I get it digitally, you know, and then I have to go and print it out to try and read it. And so I will make a point about time in the next, because 21 years in South African history is, we'll make a point about time. Right. So the TRC saw itself as not just a bridge, but a historic bridge. Those were its own words in its own report prepared by the commissioners, that it saw itself as a historic bridge between the past and the future. That links in exactly to that theoretical lecture I gave at the beginning about the hybrid nature and the bridging of the past with the future. So it saw itself as a primary midwife in giving birth to, and I will not give up this analogy, in giving birth to the new South Africa. It's a great analogy. And in terms of understanding its functioning, it felt that it needed to transcend the divisions and strife of the past characterized by mass violations of gross human rights, and the transgression of humanitarian principles, even in violent conflicts, and the legacy, in fact, of hatred, fear, guilt, and revenge that apartheid had left us at this time and even today. And so the Commission said, in order to address hatred, fear, guilt, and revenge, it needed to demonstrate understanding but not vengeance. So there's a guiding principle of the TRC. It needed to demonstrate, it needed to actively demonstrate understanding but not vengeance. It needed to focus on reparation and not retaliation. And it needed to be based on the principle of Ubuntu and not victimization. These are the guiding principles that the Commission felt were what underpinned, if you like, the way in which it approached everything it did. Ubuntu, of course, is an African, not just a South African, and I don't often talk about African concepts because there's this awful myth that Africa is a country somewhere down there, and it has a monolithic and homogeneous culture and cuisine. I'm often asked about, what's it like to eat African food? And someone told me the other day that they know where South Africa is, it's next to Ghana. And I kind of, you know, well, I am a human being only through others. I am because you are. That's Ubuntu. So this commission, Archbishop Tutu and his commission and all the commissioners operated on that principle that they are because we are. Sounds abstract, but it has a pretty profound meaning also in the context then of what we will get to, which is accepting the principle of restorative justice. And I want to talk about restorative justice and how it functioned in the commission. So in order to advance reconciliation and reconstruction, the commission felt that amnesty was a central and important part of it achieving those three, if you like, strands or ways in which it functioned. The cutoff date originally, as I said, was the 6th of December 1993. But think about the problem that those political parties who had perpetrated in our streets during our negotiated transition such awful acts of violence right up until the election, which was the end of April in '94. A bit of a gap there. And there were people who had done things who wanted to be included in the amnesty process. So political parties were saying, well, we don't like that, it's included in the Constitution, but that date doesn't work for us, we need that date changed. The interesting thing, of course, is there was unanimity. It wasn't a problem. Everyone agreed. You get the sarcasm in my voice when I say that. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And the new cutoff date was the inauguration of President Mandela, the 10th of May 1994. So anyone who had committed human rights violations up to that point could apply then for amnesty, which is why I said earlier I wanted to talk about the change in date. Now, in order to be a bridge, in order to be a historic bridge, the Commission felt that besides those operating principles, those principles that it operated under, it needed to do something else. It needed to establish as complete a picture as possible of the injustices that had been committed in the past. So it felt one of its primary functions in the context of operating the way that I described was to complete this picture of injustices that we didn't know about. And that it needed to do this in the context of a public acknowledgement, an official acknowledgement of the untold suffering which up to now had been hidden away in South Africa. So this task then, and all the tasks ultimately of the Commission, you can see as being riddled with tension and riddled with challenge. Amnesty, telling of the truth, navigating between the truth and amnesty, lots of tension, lots of challenge, nothing straightforward there. Many South Africans, especially because of the time lag between human rights violations, reparations, and amnesty in the middle, were saying, well, you know, we've heard the truth, we've seen people get amnesty, but where on earth is the justice? Why don't we see the justice in this process? And this sort of tiered, time-laggy process meant that that question began to come to the fore more and more often. And that letter that is dated tomorrow is about this. It's not over. And so the Kulumani support group is still pressing very hard for that which never really happened properly, which is, of course, the reparation side of the equation. And we'll talk about that. I'm going to spend an entire hour, if you want me to, on reparations. And indeed, why we still haven't finished it even now. And I'd love to read that letter if I get a chance, but I want to read it. You know, I've read it already. I don't know. It's in the future. I feel it's in the future. Yeah. All right, so we didn't have the sense of justice necessarily emerging from this. There were other sources of tension. The public nature of the Commission itself. Transparency was what it called a dual-edged sword. It was, of course, committed to transparency, so don't get me wrong in relation to this criticism. It was all for it. But if we think about it, then so what did people see? They saw, for example, a security police officer demonstrating his torture techniques. Because they had to tell the truth to get amnesty, they had to be very detailed. And so very step-by-step descriptions of torture and murder and other things happened. We saw that. We saw weeping men and women, even children in some instances, young boys, asking for the truth about their loved ones, wanting to know where they were, or at least just what happened to them. Some of the images were deeply disturbing, and I'm going to give you a snippet of some of this. And there's no doubt that it raised the general awareness of our sordid history. There's no doubt that transparency enabled us to understand our history in a way that we hadn't up to then. And certainly, if you think about the TRC as giving birth to a new democracy, then by upholding democratic values of transparency and accountability and openness, it was helping to embed those values in a country that had never really valued those before. We didn't know what that really meant as South Africans, and now we were for the first time seeing what transparency meant, what openness meant, what it meant to be open in public fora like this one. But of course, perceptions were being formed by the snippets that the media focuses on. And so we have that challenge in relation to selling newspapers, sensationalism, and what you then begin to understand when you see only the media bits and not necessarily the fuller pictures of things. And so in that respect, the TRC felt that being open to the public in that way, only through the media, the mass media, was also a double-edged sword for it, because it created perceptions which became problematic public debates for it. But by and large, so the sound bites, the headlines, the photographs contributed on the one hand and undermined on the other. And so there was that dualism that the TRC recognized also in its final report. The other one, and I will stop now because we want questions, don't we? Yeah, let's just say those tensions that I spoke about between the times, the time frames, was the other thing that the Commission significantly felt was a problem. Was there a question? Yes, ma'am.
When amnesty was denied, was there mercy?
To the extent that there was a criminal prosecution, a legal process, that's the kind of mercy that would then be shown. In some instances, there wasn't enough evidence to mount a criminal case. In others, there was a criminal case. It then became mercy in the context of criminal and civil proceedings. Yeah, and whatever those judgments were would be legally binding, so there would be typical legal outcomes. So as soon as you weren't given amnesty, you were then subject to the normal legal procedures. If you were given amnesty, it was the opposite. And then there was mercy. Yeah, there was. I see you and then you, if I'll go in that order. So the lady in red first.
Once the TRC was formed and the commission was formed,
yeah,
and their purpose and committees, how did people apply to be considered for either amnesty or reparation?
Yeah, so there was an application process to the TRC, and the TRC, each of those committees, so in terms of reparations, the reparations committee would consider those applications and investigate those and try and understand those, and then there would be a process for consideration, and the same for the amnesty committee. Anyone seeking amnesty would apply to the committee and to the commission, and the commission would look at those applications and see if they qualified, and if they did, consider those. So there was a bureaucratic application and consideration process involved in that.
Any idea of the numbers?
Yeah, so I showed you some of those numbers. And I know that's okay, that's okay. And what I will bring next week is the actual numbers of amnesties, because I didn't show you the full picture, and you're quite right. I showed you in relation to secret amnesties, there were a very few amnesties that were granted, proportionally speaking. But I will bring you the statistics in relation to amnesty, reparations, and so forth. I don't know them off the top of my head. There were 21,000 people ultimately who participated in the TRC process. And that's also challenged now, by the way. Could we get everyone there? Did everyone have the ability to get there? Lots of considerations. South Africa is a very rural country. Not everyone even knew about it. How did people get to it, etc., etc. There was another question. Yes, sir. Yes, you.
Yeah, so my original question...
I should have started with you. I'm sorry.
Was, that was not the war prison in New York. That was another war prison. So, and the question following that was, did the police give way, or were they just overwhelmed? And then the third question is, it seems to me that also a philosophical dichotomy between amnesty and reparation.
Yeah.
How do you reconcile
Yeah, that's, you know, I would like to start with a third one, but I'll start with the first because that's easy. It's definitely the World Trade Center in South Africa. You know, the extent to which the police were overwhelmed or gave way is a good question, because we know that the police as we understand them would have been apartheid police, excepting to say that at the World Trade Center we had a representative police force, so that was one of the things we needed to have there. And so I would suggest that they were overwhelmed in our instance right there and then, because we had a range of security forces, and indeed even the political parties had some of their own security folk around there as well, to give them protection and other things. If, you know, if a political dignitary was there, he or she would have. So I do think they were. I mean, we were all taken by surprise, overwhelmed, in shock. It was just a complete. They swept in there, overwhelmed us. We ran for our lives, hid away. It was that kind of scenario, and because it wasn't expected. You know, I don't think we expected it. We didn't expect. We knew the thing was going to happen out there. Things happen, you know, in front of a place like this. But we never thought that would happen. So I don't think we were that necessarily prepared. That changed. There was another question here and then a question there. So I'm going to go this way. You had a question, yes?
I was wondering if, when the committees heard things, were these both by individuals or organizations? And if there was a finding, so to speak, of amnesty, did that require them to go to reparations? Was there that kind of linkage? And then even at that point, with an individual, would there have been restorative justice available?
So the question, in effect, is one of what were the linkages between the different functions that the Commission had to perform in relation to someone coming in, seeking amnesty. Then did that automatically trigger a reparations process and a rehabilitative process and so forth? It was never as clean and as perfect as you describe it there. And a lot of the Commission's own understanding of its job was not really to facilitate one-on-one rehabilitation and reparation and indeed reconciliation. And so in some instances it was successful in terms of that flow that you described, but there was never any sort of natural or automatic or expected flow in the way that you describe it. It could not, it might not, is probably a better way to describe it. It would have always tried as best it could, but I wouldn't suggest that it was, you know, we have a clean flow chart and you would think, well, after you've got the amnesty, you would automatically do that and that and that. It did the best it could under the circumstances to do as much as it could, is probably the best way I can answer that question.
Did it include institutions or just always individuals?
So that, yes, and so and I will describe this. The committee included institutions and individuals, and indeed also held thematic hearings around business, religion, etc., to determine societal sectoral complicitness or otherwise in relation to human rights violations. So there were organizations, political parties definitely were required to come. There's lots of footage about them trying to say sorry and not saying sorry and things like that. So yes, there were institutions, there were organizations, there were entire sectors like chambers of business and others that had to turn up, and of course individuals. There was a question here and then a question here.
How was the Constitutional Court appointed and who was in that? Did they get associated with any of those people with apartheid?
So no is the answer to the association with apartheid, and they were appointed by the president. Yeah, they don't have lifelong appointments like you have here. They're appointed by their age, and they have between 7 and 15 years, depending on their age when they go in. So there's a point where you choose a justice, they're X years old, and that means they can stay 7 or 8 or up to 15, and that's the end of that.
Did they come into being, I mean, were they appointed by the president before Mandela?
No, no. So they were appointed by the newly elected President Mandela. Yeah, yeah. So the Constitutional Court needed that legitimacy in order to enable us to get rid of the baggage, also the judicial baggage of the past. Because if you think about the complexion of people who had been killed by the state, so hanging, so the death penalty meant hanging. So that's how South Africa killed people, was it strung them up on a rope, with a scaffold. That's so who got the death penalty? It was black men by and large who were executed en masse by the state, in that particular fashion. And so we had to shrug off that part. And I really don't necessarily want to discredit our judiciary. We've had an amazing judiciary in South Africa. We've got an amazing history of rule of law and some independent-minded advocates and judges and so forth. I don't just want to discredit the entire legal profession here and say it was all a mess and it was all wrong and needed to be abandoned. But by and large, and also in terms of thinking about going forward, we needed a constitutional court to be the arbiter of these bigger human rights issues, including then these questions of legitimacy and credibility in relation to legal outcomes. I think we'll take a last question because I think we've literally run out of time. Rich, you'll tell me if we've run out of time.
I was wondering if someone were brought into, say criminal court, back in this time frame, could a criminal court justice look at the nature of the suit and say, this really belongs in front of the amnesty court?
No. No, is the short answer, and the reason for that is if they didn't apply for amnesty, they were done for. They were literally, that was the end of their story. Then they went into a criminal proceeding. The judge would have said, you've forfeited your amnesty opportunity, bad luck. Thank you so much, everyone.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you. Big hand. Thank you very much.